Welcome, second week of the fall lectures. I wanted to introduce David Haney because he joined us a year ago. Maybe not all of you know him. Quite a few of you hopefully got to know him in the classes he's teaching. He's teaching history and theory this year.
Well, his history is undergraduate here in this room, Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11 to 12:15.
So David received his master's in environmental design from Yale and his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. He's practiced as an architect in New York City and taught in England at a couple of universities for 13 years. He's come to us most recently from Berlin. It seems like you've had a long relationship with Berlin.
Yeah.
Fulbright back in 2000 to study in Berlin. David is a prolific and accomplished scholar. His previous book, When Modernism Was Green, was awarded the 2013 Society of Architectural Historians Award. I'll tell you, those are really hard to get. And he was awarded the Levenhulme Award to support the research for his latest book, Architecture and Nazi Cultural Landscape, which is what we'll be lecturing about today. So join me in welcoming you.
Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate your time. It's a great opportunity to be able to speak to you a lot of the school. And I just want to say briefly, I have whooping cough, which is why I've got a slightly raspy voice. So, but hopefully the cough won't take off while I'm lecturing. Anyway, this is my most recent book, as Sharon said in her nice introduction, Architecture in the Nazi Cultural Landscape. And it just came out in 2022, about 2 years ago. Anyway, this image that I selected, it's actually the cover for a high-end ladies' fashion magazine called The New Line, Die Neue Linie. And as you probably know, all media in the Nazi era was very carefully controlled. So this was giving you an image of the national cultural landscape, which is very important to the regime. And it's just kind of a shorthand for my book. So with the subject of my book. So here is the 1936 Olympics, the Congress Hall and the Nuremberg Party Rally Grounds, and then down here, the King's Plaza Königsplatz in Munich. So it's just giving you an idea of how the architecture actually sets up this new national territory. So it's the new Nazi monuments with the older monuments together, and that's what they were trying to do. Now, obviously, as we know, National Socialism is a rather difficult topic, and I'll come back to that. And you may wonder why on earth I decided to do this in the first place. And as Sharon said, my first book, which came out in 2010, When Modern Was Green, the idea there was to find or bring ecology back into the discussion of modernism, because what I found out was, largely because of the association with National Socialism, they were very interested in ecology, and been kind of written off, and people in the 50s weren't very interested in it. So I brought this back into the discussion, and I was amazed at just how important landscape and ecology were for that period. As you can see on the cover of a housing project in Frankfurt a few years after it was built. Anyway, my main interests have always been, as a researcher, in the relationship between landscape and architecture, even though I am trained as an architect. That's something that I really like. For me, that seems really normal, but I realize for a lot of people, it's a slightly niche way of looking at things. But I think I can see different things about the architecture by looking at the landscape as well. Now, the other way that I got into it is because the guy that I was writing about, as it turns out, was excited about National Socialism. He never actually got any jobs from the Nazis, but this was a big thing for me. And this was about, I was working on my PhD dissertation, and it's kind of a shock, and I wasn't happy about it. But I thought, after I finished that book, I thought, well, I really want to know more about it. And it was a completely different experience, as you can imagine, working on modernism and working on National Socialism. It was just kind of night and day. And with the modernism, I knew a little bit about the political situation that was happening in Germany. But with National Socialism, you really have to understand the politics. Otherwise, your work is just completely superficial, and that's not what I wanted. One of my main questions about it was, why were the Nazis so excited about landscape architecture? What was the big deal about landscape? Because the profession just kind of exploded in the 1930s in a way that it hadn't done before. Now, this is a history lecture, and I regret to say that this topic is not, it's not gone. It's come back quite strongly. If you read in the news, but in the German state elections, there were two last Sunday. The far-right Alternative for Germany, the AfD, won the majority vote in the state of Thuringia. And this character is the head of it for that state, Björn Höcke. And you see there in that sign up in the upper left said Björn Höcke is a Nazi, and I'm afraid I have to agree with that. But this is the first time a state election's been carried by an extremist far-right party since 1930. So this is something to kind of wake us all up. These issues are not dead. That is to say, the problem of race and social exclusion and so on. On the right is one of their posters, and you see this looks like a summer vacation poster, and it says, with the plane, it says summer, sun, and re-migration, because they want to send back all the nasty foreigners back to where they came from. So these things are still very upsettingly still alive. Now, a lot closer to home, which is about a 2.5-hour drive from here in Charlottesville, you may well remember that in 2017, there was a Unite the Right rally, and in fact, someone was deliberately killed there by a car. And, if you look over on the left, you see the Nazi flag, the swastika flag among the Confederate flags. And this is the kind of symbolism and rhetoric that we're seeing. And what was it all about? The far right, they were very upset about the proposal to remove the statue of Robert E. Lee from Lee Park. Now, what's this got to do with us? Well, it's a park, it's a statue, and it's part of this urban ensemble, right? So it's art, architecture, and landscape and planning all together. So it's very much about what we do. Now, this was done in the early 1920s, but nevertheless, it involves us in some way in our professions. It's not, politics aren't over there and we're over here. We're very much touched by this. And I hope that that's something that I want to get across in the lecture. And the statue was finally melted down last year. So these things are still very much going on, as you know. Now, this appropriation of National Socialism, as I'm sure you can imagine, it's at different levels. Some people really understand it, and some people, it's quite naive, but it's about white power, right? Because Robert E. Lee represented, the South, which is about, whiteness, however you want to define that. And that's what they were upset about. One of the things that they chanted over and over again was a Nazi slogan, blood and soil, right? Blut und Boden in German. And I've just listed here some of the terms. And on the top is Blut und Boden. And so what's blood? What is that referring to? Well, they're talking about race, right? This is one of the most important parts of the whole Nazi platform. It was all about the German race, or let's say a kind of family of races, and that everything was for them, right? So this is a totally socially exclusive program. There was nothing subtle about it at all. And so the idea is that the races are related to the soil in a kind of pseudo-scientific way, so that the German race sort of grew up literally out of the German soil. And so the race and soil belong together, and this can't be separated. So you kind of move up to different scales from the stuff you can hold in the hand, the dirt, up to geopolitics, which is another German phrase. So you think about land, which of course is soil, right? Whereas in Germany, that also means country, right? So it's Deutschland, right? German land. Cultural landscape is another German term from the early 19th century, Kulturlandschaft, but it was really popularized in the late 19th century. And the Nazis were very excited about this. This is a major operational concept for them, because I'm talking about the earlier phase, let's say pre-1940, pre-1939 here. And so they were trying to consolidate the country, and I'll come culturally, and I'll come back to that. Bodenständig is a little bit more subtle. It can be like earth-rooted or native. Then another word that was quite used was Landschaftsgebunden. So it's like the architecture was either landscape-oriented or connected to the landscape. And then homeland, or Heimat, which is still a term that's used. It's not necessarily a Nazi term, but it had the specific racial connotations to it. And geopolitics or Geopolitik, this is, it's about geography and politics. So it's politics at the scale of geography and related to territory and land and borders. So all these terms could be sort of used in related ways during this period. And so this is what I'm trying to convey in this lecture. It's just how important the cultural landscape was, because it wasn't just the land, it was also the soil, but it was the cultural products. The architecture was really critical, you know, because they're like landmarks. So I'll get more into this, and we'll start with Hitler, kind of an obvious place. And this was one of his table conversations that he had with his intimates. And I didn't find, this is really the only place where he really talks about landscape that I could find, although it's clear from his actions that it's really important, right? So he says, you know, in the last 6 years, the landscape beauties of the Reich have substantially increased. So you think, okay, the last 6 years, this is 1948, 44, so that would have been beginning with the annexation of Austria, right? Which was like, you know, annexed, but it was really seized in a kind of not very nice way. But anyway, so Austria was annexed. What's now the Czech Republic was a protectorate, which just also means it was kind of annexed. And so he's talking about, in addition to Austria, when I think of the beautiful landscapes of the regions of Bohemia and Moravia, Czech Republic, known only to a very few Germans. And he says at the end, a German who took a trip once a year within Germany alone would need their entire lifetime in order to get to know all of the beauties of their Heimat with their own eyes. Now, this is kind of a funny thing to be talking about landscape beauties. He's not talking about, you know, oil fields, or agricultural land, or ports. So what's the big deal about landscape beauties? And why should Germans need to see as many of them as they could? And of course, the answer is because it's about, well, the fatherland, that's another emotional term, but it's about territory. And territory is kind of an abstract thing, and you think, okay, it's like shapes on a map, right? Well, yeah, but to make it more, you know, to have it more emotionally resonant, let's say, and touch your heart, or whatever you want to say, sentiment, you need to see the actual place, which is a landscape, right? And the beautiful landscapes represent nature, and they represent, again, the connection of race and soil. So there was what I call the kind of touristic imperative, which is like, we think about tourism, it's about having a good time on your vacation or whatever. But this was educational tourism in a way. And to be a good German citizen, you needed to see as many beautiful landscapes as possible. And of course, the whole point of this in earlier years was to get people to identify with the territory, because it's very clear if you read Mein Kampf, My Struggle, written by Hitler, this bestseller book in the 1930s, that it was about expanding the territory. So they knew from the very beginning that they had to get people, I don't know whether these were excited, but committed to expanding the territory. Now, this is a map produced by the period, and you can see how important it was for them to represent all of these different cultures around Germany, because Germany didn't really exist as a country until 1872, right? So this idea of cultural consolidation isn't, it's not totally a Nazi issue, but they wanted everybody to feel like they were kind of a mosaic of these local cultures and local landscapes, including the architecture around the country. And one of the ways to unite that was the new Autobahn system, which is like their interstate highway, right? Which predates ours, which is from the 1950s. And I'll come back to that. Anyway, it says here, we are one people and we want to live in one Reich. And the Reich is a realm, right? So it's all about getting people to think about this one place. And of course, here is what's now Kaliningrad, the old Prussia. And this is where World War II started, around Danzig, because this was Poland, which disappeared from the late 18th century until 1918. And the Allies, the Versailles Treaty, gave them this land bridge, which the conservative Germans didn't like at all. Anyway, this is a later map. So in the beginning, in the early 30s, there weren't any Nazi buildings. So by this point, by 1939, this is May 1939, this is just a few months before the war started in September 39. And you're supposed to, as you know, a good Nazi, you're supposed to recognize what all this means. And it's the national cultural landscape. And again, it's an Autobahn map. But what I've done is here, because it was like a Rosetta Stone for me, was to go through a number of the 12 case studies the 12 architectural sites that I was looking at, and we'll look at a few of those today in more detail. But the point that I'm trying to get across to you is that it's not just a collection of 12 buildings. It's about the idea of having this kind of map in your mind where you have key points are occupied by these monumental sites, right? So they existed as a kind of collection, and together that's the cultural territory, the cultural landscape, and that's the way they really thought about it. Now, there are a number of geographers which are in the background here, as you might imagine. One of them is Friedrich Ratzel, who wrote really a lot. And when he wrote this political geography in 1897, Germany had a number of African colonies. So this was kind of directed at that. But the point that I want to make here with these two citations is that when we talk about cultural landscape now, it's like an amenity, like a seashore with a collection of buildings, or farmland in the valley with maybe a village and some barns and houses and so on. They need to be preserved, right? But this is much more emotional here, and mythic is another word to attach to that, or heroic. And he says, changes made to the soil as part of the culture result in a mythopoetic formation, right? And then he talks about the intense work of the forebears, our ancestors. It can only be comprehended as an act of creation. So this is something that's, it's almost holy in a way when he's talking about it. And this is another citation. The state's like an organism for us because of the connection between the living people and the immobile earth. And he says, that this connection is so strong that they become one. They can't really be separated. And you can't, the life flows away when you separate them. And another way that they talked about it was if, they use the example of Sweden. If you took all the people out of Sweden, and Sweden was an empty piece of territory, it wouldn't be Sweden anymore. And the people who went somewhere else, even if they took some of their cultural objects, wouldn't be Sweden either. So from a European context, the race, that is the Germans or the Swedish or whatever, are connected to this piece of land. And so it became really critical during this period that piece of land was assigned to that race, and that should be a matter of some racial purity, right? And these ideas haven't completely gone away. If we think about immigration issues today, and the current thing about sending all the foreigners back home for this, as kind of a dark, ironic summer holiday joke. Now, Ratzel was, as I said, probably the first one to really popularize the term of cultural landscape. And this is from a cover of his book. It was about Germany, Deutschland, and he's talking about the main landscapes there. And so you've got over on this side, hang on a second, over on this side to the left, that's the Baltic, right? Then you've got the Middle Mountains, and this is the subalpine region. And so he describes all these regions. So one of the main points of the book is to get you to see Germany first and understand this connection between the soil and the race, right? Now, I won't go through the whole chain of people, but these ideas kind of filtered into Hitler's thinking and overall into Nazi thinking. And I discovered this character who is almost, virtually unknown because he had to, he was given a Schreibverbot. He was forbidden to write because he actually wrote an article that said that Hitler was too far to the left, if you can imagine that, and that upset some of the Nazi party. But he had, connections. He knew this famous geographer, Karl Haushofer, who sort of got him in the door, but he couldn't use his name ever. So and I'll come to why he's important for architecture in a second. But anyway, these are some of his earlier books that he wrote for a German educational society or a Nazi educational society. So this was sent out to youth to teach them about Germany. So you see here, German people, German Heimat. And on the left-hand side is an old city in Germany. And on the right-hand side is a German settlement in Poland. Because in fact, there were, and farther to the east even, there were Germanic settlements all over Eastern Europe. But there's a point here, clearly. And he's saying here, thus the pictures in this book intentionally reach out beyond the borders of the Reich in 1939 and attempt to represent all German settlement areas in Europe. Well, the reason for that is because they wanted to say, these are ours and we want them back. And then once the war started, the veil was lifted and they just said, look, we got all these things back that we needed. And he continued to publish along those lines. Now, again, to try to make all this more emotional, They used different kinds of graphics. You see here this hand, it's a Czech hand trying to pull away part of eastern Bavaria, allegedly in collusion with the French. But on the right-hand side, this is more what we're talking about, is this homeland or cultural landscape. And this is a border that was set out by the Versailles Treaty, which they absolutely hated, of course. And you can see, in order to make that really emotional, instead of just showing you a map, it's this jagged line coming through this beautiful little Germanic village, right? So it's supposed to really get you upset. And this is about the Slavic threat from the east. So again, it's racial, right? Now, what's particularly significant is there's one, well, there are several, but the most important architectural survey book of the period is this one. And it was actually written by this guy, who, as I said, was trained as a geographer. It was credited to Gerty Trost, who was the widow of Hitler's first favorite architect, Paul Trost, but she just kind of approved it. It was a marketing gimmick. So he's writing this little thing to her in a letter, trying to propose this is why we want to use your name. And the key thing was he wants to talk about the informed adaptation of construction to the landscape. And of course, we think of that as kind of a nice design idea. But again, here, it's bound to this idea of blood and soil in a really literal way. So it's about, the buildings are embedded in the landscape. And he's talking at the German Architectural Exhibition in 1938. And he said, thousands looked upon the coming face of the National Socialist cultural landscape. So again, it's about bringing architecture, the buildings, as literal landmarks into this whole discussion of territory, right? And this is a really critical move. And as you may know, Hitler was obsessed with architecture, and he was rejected from architecture school in Vienna, unfortunately for world history. Anyway, this is the House of German Art, and I'm not going to go through the whole book because we're going to come to the case studies quite shortly. But this is the kind of neoclassical style that his first architect did, Paul Trost, and this is in the English Garden in Munich, and it's still there, it's been restored, it's still an art museum. But this was a really critical location for the propagation of Nazi culture. And these are kind of two extremes about marking the landscape. This is from the second volume that came out after the war started, right? But it's sort of a continuation. And you see on the left what looks like a monument, right? You might immediately know that it's a monument, designed by the architect Wilhelm Kreis. There was supposed to be a whole series of them. There was even one down in North Africa and a couple more in Eastern Europe, I think in Armenia, that was supposed to mark the kind of critical edges of the German Empire that they were trying to put together on the continent. On the right, it's a little bit more subtle. It's a new German settlement, a Siedlung, in Eastern Poland. And of course, the thought of Eastern Poland is it should really be Germany, and some people still think that. But anyhow, it was going to be, and I'll conclude with this, it was going to be a part of the resettlement. So once they got rid of the Slavs or turned them into slaves, then they were going to completely actually reshape the landscape and build new villages and new farms after a rational planning order. So this is another kind of monumental project, but not on the scale of the individuals, but in fact on a continental scale of building farms. Now, this is the Autobahn. As I said, the interstate highway system in this country started in, excuse me, in the 1950s, and actually President Eisenhower during the war had been in Germany and was very impressed by the Autobahn system. So there's definitely a historical connection here. There was already a proposal before Hitler took power to have a national highway system. But the Nazis took it over and they made it theirs, and it became referred to as Hitler's roads, right? And it was a great propaganda device. And you see Hitler turning up the first shovel full of dirt and so on. And then on the right-hand side is a journal that was actually dedicated just to the construction of the Autobahn, the design of it called Die Strasse, the road. And so this, as I said, was a really important propaganda device. And I'll come back to the same map. It was promoted partly on military grounds, so that didn't really work because moving soldiers was still more commodious with trains, right? That was the better way to get them around. So it was also, and they recognized this, some of the architectural critics were saying this, it was a network that bound all of these monumental sites together. So it was really critical. At the same time, Hitler and others decided that it should be a landscape project. So one landscape architect was put in charge of the landscape advocates who were advocating, for nature, let's say, and they would construct these kind of, like historic and wild landscapes alongside the highway. So you had this kind of strip-like experience of the German landscape. And there were also points where they wanted you to see different things like historic monuments. And of course, they would take you places like the the Nazi Party rally grounds in Nuremberg. So it was about getting people around as quickly as possible to these sites. And in the interim, seeing these beautiful landscapes, which would all be different from the different territories, right? And the historic architecture. So that was all part of the project. And this is somewhat less architectural, but it gives you an idea of just how important this was when it was a propaganda device. And this is, I think, from 1943, an exhibition in Budapest, right? And it's about, this is old Europe on the left and new Europe on the right, which is obviously much better according to them. So on the left, you see England, which is this kind of black, England and Scotland, well, Britain is this kind of black blob, and everything ends up in London, right? So because everything's running by seas, you see the red line there. And somehow the Soviet Union is just kind of gray mass off to the side. But anyhow, the Autobahn landscape will be entirely different. You'd be able to drive from Berlin to Ankara and I guess on to Saudi Arabia, it looks like, which is rather ambitious. And now all these lines going to the right are headed towards the Soviet Union, right? In the meantime, look what's in the center, it's Berlin, right? So this is now the new, freer, better organized Europe. Now, how exactly that was freer, we don't know, but this is the kind of, this is the importance that was attached to the Autobahn system, also on a geopolitical level. And just to give you some imagery from it, as I said, this landscape architect, Alvin Seifert, and his team, it was supposed to be modern and traditional at the same time. So you see the hayricks on the upper left-hand side, and this is a new, right under that with the children by this pump. This is a new, rest area by the highway. You have this wooden pump there and so on. So it was about technology, but it's also about, traditional culture in the landscape. And you can see it was also celebrated as an engineering feat. So there's a little diagram showing you that there was more soil and stone and so on moved than there was for the Panama Canal. And it was very much, as I said, an architectural project. The mid-image was for a gateway designed by Albert Speer for the Austrian border, right? And on the left-hand side, you see how they put wildflowers in between on the median strip there. And then there's a woman on the lower left who's contemplating this kind of pastoral landscape with this beautiful curving road going through it. And on the right-hand side is a bridge designed by Paul Bonatz, and it's actually a real masonry bridge, but it's constructed to frame that view of an old town center. So it's very much, again, about this cultural landscape, and you're supposed to experience it while you're in your car, which is the most modern way to do it. Now, I'll start with a series of case studies, and I said they're all numbered, which these are my numbers, these are not historic. Let's see if I can see them now. So this is Berlin, and sort of curiously, they don't have the Nazi stadium there. And then this is Nuremberg. And we'll start with those two. And I'm sort of, in my book, I start with the biggest scale and kind of go down. So geopolitically, it's sort of easy to figure out that Berlin is the capital city, right? So, and the Olympics were there. A little bit more complicated story. Some of you may have heard of the Holy Roman Empire, which was actually composed mostly of Germanic states. And in the Middle Ages, for quite some time, Nuremberg was the capital of the Holy Roman Empire. So that was a big deal for the Nazis. They really wanted to celebrate that. And so they'd started already in the 20s having their annual party rallies in Nuremberg, but they didn't have permanent facility there. The Olympics is a slightly different story because, of course, the Olympic Committee awarded Berlin, just like they do now. So we're going to have it in Berlin in 1936. But this is before the Nazis came to power. And the Nazis realized that wouldn't have happened if they'd been in power. And at first Hitler said, no, we're not going to do this. It's too international. And then the propaganda minister, Goebbels, convinced him that it was a good idea. And it was the first time But this had been turned into a really big show, so to speak, and various things were started there for the first time. But what was also important was both of these sites were on landscapes that weren't in great shape on the edge of the city. So it's about trying to go from the urban, which you see here on this plan on the right-hand side, out into these parks that were, in this case, around Berlin. So to try to bring the homeland back into the city in a way. And you can see here how it's a fairly tight configuration. Most of it still exists. And you have this axis here with the stadium and the Mayfield, and this is the Langemark Hall, which I'll talk about. And these sports fields were already there as a kind of national center. And here's the train station to get you from the center of Berlin and so on, a series of roads. And here's a Greek theater. Just to give you an idea, this is the first project that was proposed by Werner Marsch, the architect. And it was too austere for the Nazis. They wanted something more like a landscape park. This is the city park in Hamburg, which was done right before World War I. It was a kind of new design. You can see it's very geometric, but it also has a lot of groves around where the things are inserted into. So it's a similar diagrammatic design that they're doing here. So you can see the groves are kind of surrounding this, but there's that main axis, which of course was important for the Nazis for multiple reasons, because they were into processing. And of course, the Olympics starts with, in this case, with the torch procession, right? And here are some images on the left-hand side. That's a sort of pre-construction photo with Hitler and Wilhelm Frick, who was the Minister of the Interior, and so he was paying for everything. So the myth that came up, you can see Hitler gesturing like this, was everything was Hitler's design, but of course that's nonsense. It wasn't his idea at all. But that's kind of what they had to say because, he was the dictator. And, but here you see an aerial view with the main spaces there. And it's all very carefully done as an ensemble. And this is the first time that really happened. In Los Angeles, it was mostly buildings that already existed. They didn't really build anything. And the Paris and Amsterdam Olympics were slightly more architectural, nothing like this. This is really the first one that's the kind of Olympics that we think of now, where it's this major infrastructural project, although of course the Paris ones weren't quite like that. But anyhow, and over there on the right is the torch bearer getting ready to light the cauldron in the stadium. Now, moving around, you can see how important it was that all the buildings were inserted in the landscape, and they had an important landscape architect here named Heinrich Wiebking, who made sure that the whole place looked like it had been there a long time by bringing trees and other plantings, which sounds kind of like, just a nice thing to do. But again, it had to do with bringing in the homeland landscape, that is the area around it of Brandenburg. So it looked like it was part of, the German territory. And probably the most blatant in terms of symbolism of all the structures there is this one, which is the Langemark Hall, which is still there, and you can still go and visit it. It's a kind of exhibition about the National Socialist period. But rather weirdly, if you go to the main entrance, there's no mention of it. You can't get to it. You have to walk all the way around to get to it. But anyway, this is it. And you can see it here in section. This is a photograph. This is the Mayfield, which is a big marching field. And you can see this tower, which had an elevator in it, and the bell tower, and you can go up the platform, which you still can. But it has a very strange personality in a way, or character. As you see here, it looks like you're going underground. These are large earthen berms, and the soil was taken here from the excavation of the stadium. So it's the precious German soil. And there's actually a photograph of it. This picture is from the book on the construction of the stadium. So it's not incidental. Now, Langemark was a World War I battle in Belgium. And it was legendary among the Nazis. Of course, they gave it their own story, was that these young men who were like 15, 16, 14 even years old were massacred in this battle. And so this was very important for them to try to get this message to the German youth that, you need to support your country, right? And of course, that also meant militarily. So if you look here, this is actually a box of soil, which is pretty literal, from Langemark. that the organizer of the Olympics brought with him. And you can see here there are plaques up on the wall honoring the dead, and of course a wreath and so on. But this was kind of kept to the side in the Olympics. People could see it, but it wasn't the main emphasis. But it was there about to inspire the German youth to fight for the fatherland. But it's a very odd kind of architectural configuration. You can see how there, as I said, on this side is the stadium or the marching field, and this is the tribune for Hitler. And here it looks as though you're entering in a kind of underground tomb. So this is one of the ways that they, again, literally interpreted these principles. The first torch relay, or the first, what are you going to call it, race, or whatever you want to call it, was done for the Nazi Olympics. And it's never gone away since. And this is another way I'm trying to tell you that it was really important in Olympic history, despite the political implications. So you see the picture on the left is the route they took from Olympia in Greece all the way up to Berlin. And so there was this kind of whole mythology constructed that there was actually some relationship between Greece and Germany, which, I'm not going to go into that, but again, it's about territory, right? And crossing territory in this big organization along a road, right? And there you see the original torches, which were designed by the Krupp firm in Germany. And here's just a kind of an image of all the roads and railroads coming to the 36 Olympics, because that was the kind of symbolism that they wanted. And then this is a later image. I'm not going into this too much, but Albert Speer, the architect, wanted to redesign Berlin. This would be a new university, and he wanted to sort of dwarfs the old Olympic site. But Speer didn't like it because he didn't do it, so therefore he kind of resented the project. That's another story. Anyway, this is also the first Olympic village that really looked like a village. There was an Olympic village in Los Angeles. It was on top of a hill and fantastic views and great weather. But it was just a bunch of sort of mass-produced huts around a kind of big running track. It didn't look like a village at all. Whereas the Nazis decided this is really going to look like a village. So they took the site, which really, really needed a lot of work, and made this kind of giant village green. It was paid for by the military because the army was going to take it over as barracks after the war. But the point was to create this kind of naturalistic landscape, which is a bit ironic considering how much effort and expense was actually taken to make it look that way. And here's another one of these games they're playing with maps. So the buildings were set out on this map of Germany. So each one represented a different district. So it was supposed to, in a way, kind of correspond to that map. And then you see over here the sauna and a still from Leni Riefenstahl's propaganda film about the Olympics. And so it's naked young men who are athletes. And so it's about, again, the engagement of the body with the landscape, right? And this wasn't incidental. That's what they were thinking when they did it. This is, moving right along, this is the Nazi Party rally grounds. I said it wasn't really supposed to be a government organization, but once they took over the government, it was. But anyway, once a year, usually in September, they would have their party rally. And so it was really only supposed to be used once a year. It just kept growing and growing and growing. And you see this model produced by Albert Speer, and this was the original part here, Leopoldplatz, and then this is the Congress Hall that I showed you earlier, the Zeppelin field, which I'm sure you've seen, and the Mars field. Much of it's been demolished. This was going to be the new German stadium because, according to Hitler, all Olympic ceremonies were going to be held at Nuremberg from now on, and that's where they would happen, which was just logical to him. Now, if you look at the scale over here, you can see the new Autobahn, because it was really in these intersections. It's really important to get people there as quickly as possible. But this is old Nuremberg here, right? And this is the new rally grounds. Look at the size of it. It was absolutely enormous. So this was part of, creating it's almost like a little territory in itself, but it was a kind of, almost a geopolitical statement because of its scale. So the original site that was there was fairly disorganized. This is kind of the before picture, and the Zeppelin field ended up going here, I believe, and here are some lakes that were there. And so the whole point was to make it, organized and suitable for Nazi processions. So we needed a great axis, right, and not kind of a big road. So originally it was going to line up with this Leopoldplatz, which was already there. but they decided to shift it later on. And the reason was so that when you're going down this axis, you would have a view of the Nuremberg Castle. And this is the Die Neue Linie, the ladies' fashion magazine I was mentioning before. It has all kinds of amazing images like this. This was the new rest stop along the Autobahn, but it would also give you a view back of the city of Nuremberg. So it was about, bringing in these landscapes and monuments into the site. This was really critical, and that's why this axis was relocated at that angle. And this is the landscape plan from the 1940s, because they didn't stop the planning of this place. It just kept going on because it was so important to them. Now, looking at these images, on the right-hand side is the what was equivalent to the Civilian Conservation Corps there, which is, the Reichsarbeiter, and they're young men who are shirtless with shovels, right? And then what could be more literal, a connection between the body and the soil than these young men with their shovels? So that's what that symbolism is. But the reason I'm including it there is that this is a view out off into the landscape, in the background, because the idea was, this is from an airplane, it's still kind of the same idea, that these avenues would be organized so that you would see a certain hill, or as I said, the castle at Nuremberg. So that was part of the overall planning. Now, the next set of sites I'll look at are the order castles, and they're called that because it's about a knightly order. So it's supposed to make you think of the German knights. So they were trying to really recreate this kind of medieval imagery. And you can see this one here, Kosensee, which is really close to the then Polish border, and this one, which is Vogelzang, which is really close to the Belgian border, and this one here, which is Sonthofen, which had a direct view of the Alps in Austria, which is another kind of political statement. So they were put in these regions because of the geopolitical significance of being next to a border. And they were all kind of problematic in different reasons, especially in the beginning. And the other thing that they did was that these were like training camps or training facilities for the future Nazi elite. And so they were almost like military academies, but in the early days, in the early 30s, they couldn't do that because of the Versailles Treaty, right? That would have been forbidden. So it was like a military academy with no purpose, but they knew that that's the kind of symbolism that they were aiming at. And the other thing that all the sites have in common is they're all in heavily touristed landscapes. So the one in Sonthofen is like a skiing landscape, and then the one in the upper left is there was a lot of mountain climbing there in the Eiffel Mountains, but also horseback riding and so on. On the right-hand side was a very kind of watery area near the sea, because it's now in Poland, and that was boating was a big activity there. So it was also about getting people to learn about these different cultural landscapes, and that's why they were in these different places, because again, it's about trying to get Germans to go to different parts of the country so they could identify with it on a different level. These three were planned, but they were not constructed. So the one on the left was supposed to be near France. The one on the upper right was, you look at the castle in that image, that's the restoration of the original order castle of the Teutonic Knights, right? And so the new order castle was supposed to go over here. And this one was in the far east of what's now Poland, near Lublin, on the Vistula River. And again, that was sort of like the Wild East back then. So these weren't built, but they were also supposed to be at key points. And so you had a whole collection of 6 of these, and all in these different landscapes. And the young men were supposed to spend a year in each location. So it's a long story, but these castles were actually built by Robert Bly, you maybe never heard of, but he was head of the Nazi labor union. Because when they took over, they basically, did some, in a kind of horrible way, on May the 1st, 33, knocked all the old labor unions out of existence, and that was even involved some murders as well. But anyway, this was one of his projects, because he had this enormous budget available to him. And you can see that they're built, in Rhineland, Bavaria, and Pomerania, because it's about, again, these different landscapes. But he talks here about they exploit these contrasts in the landscape and changes in geographical conditions for our sports program and carrying out our bravery tests. So this is the kind of site that he was looking at here. This is Vogelzone, which, as I said, it's near the Belgian border and the Eiffel Mountains, also in this reservoir. And so the idea was that the landscape was the whole purpose of the place. And you can see how it kind of is terraced down the mountain there to go down towards the reservoir. And that's the groundbreaking ceremony on the left. And the image from the right-hand side would have been not from the Autobahn, but from a kind of rest stop that was specifically put there. Because on the one hand, these are supposed to be, kind of secret training centers. On the other hand, it's part of the whole new Nazi world that they're trying to create, and they want people to see it. So that's part of it. But you really get a sense there, and it still exists to a large degree, of how they were trying to integrate the landscape and the architecture to create this kind of unified design, right? Because again, that would manifest their racial program as well. And this is directly from Line. He's talking about the buildings, and he said they are landscape, these walls, these halls, this plowed tower. And he's talking about how the essence of ecological principles were preserved. Its natural elements not only remain visible, but elevate the overall image into the gigantic. So it's about the sublime, right? So it's about sort of, giving the architecture that kind of resonance, connecting it to nature, in this case, the natural landscape. And you can see up on the upper left-hand side a photograph called the Sea of Clouds. And this is a view out from there over low-hanging cloud formation. So again, it's about celebrating the landscape, almost like a German Romantic era painting, and that was not incidental. On the lower left is some of the men on the parade ground there on the upper level. But someone commented at the time, it was like a wall of men in the landscape. And I sort of realized when looking through this, and you look at the image on the lower right, that the whole idea was that, they didn't have to put it on the side of the mountain, but by doing that, you would get this whole kind of layer of activity, and everybody's looking at everybody else in this kind of spectacle of a building and a landscape brought together. And that was for the lower right-hand side, was for the next phase, which didn't get realized because of the war. And also on the upper right-hand side, they had this concept of building these enormous hotels to bring people to each one of these places, particularly the members of the Nazi trade union, because they were paying for it. But it's this kind of weird usage of tourism, again, as a form of propaganda, not just like looking at posters, but getting people to these places to see what was happening. And here's another one, Zonthorfen, which is built at the foot of the Subalps in Germany, in Bavaria. And so you see on the left, upper left, it's the site visit, and then there's the wooden model by Giesler, the architect, and then there it is from a distance. So it was really critical to have this tower there so it could be part of the overall landscape. And you see here some images of it. It was around the central courtyard. It was a different kind of architecture from the other one. The courtyard faced out onto the Austrian Alps to the south. And of course, the Austrian Alps were quite nice to look at, but this is territory, and this is before Austria was annexed. And of course, Hitler was born in Austria and came from there. So this was another geopolitical gesture in the architecture, right? And here you have the tower again, which was typical of the time. It's reinforced concrete covered in stone, but it's supposed to have this kind of late medieval look to it. But it was, literally a landmark. And this was a kind of gigantic expansion of it that's what the other place didn't happen. And this is Grosensee. This is the one that was over by the border of Poland. It was a completely different landscape, quite flat. And so they used local materials like wood and brick because there was no stone there. Well, they did have some stone, glacial erratics, and they did use those. But they tried to evoke that, and also the kind of architecture of the region, which you see here, the thatch roofs and so on. So it's coming into that and sort of play off of the flatness and also off of the sea. But it wasn't regarded as being as successful architecturally as the other two, because the Nazis had this real preference for mountainous landscapes. Now, here we see a later proposal in this map, and that's all I was able to find of it. but it was going to be a whole center, if you will, this like whole region around here where these lakes are, of different like holiday camps for different Nazi organizations, like the Hitler Youth, for example. But this is the main order castle here, and here's the town. And so they were also going to have the Autobahn brought in here with the major intersections of north, south, east, west, to get people here. And so it wasn't exactly like, you know, Disneyland, but it was about trying to really celebrate this landscape as a special place and bring all the people into this kind of resort-like area. And of course, it's also about strengthening the unity between all of these different organizations as well. But this was another way, this is a way I think they tried to compensate from the less dramatic architecture, was to try to create this whole center. But you see here the two library towers that were built in this flat landscape, and also how they used these kind of level changes again to pick up on that kind of aesthetically. This is the sea resort for 20,000 at Pura, and it was also built by Robert Lai, who again was the head of the German labor union. The architect here was also Clemens Klotz, like like at Christensee. But anyway, this was, I think, over 2 miles long. It was like this chain of buildings here. And they're all hotels, because this is a sea resort for 20,000. So they were supposed to get everybody in the labor union there for something like, you know, a week or 5 days or whatever, once a year. That was the idea. But what is fascinating to me, if you look at this aerial rendering, is that this is, of course, on the Baltic. So it's almost like a kind of wall along the Baltic symbolically, even though it wasn't going to be used for defense. It nevertheless has an almost geopolitical significance to it, just because of the scale of it, right? It's absolutely enormous. And many of these buildings still exist, are being converted into summer condominiums. I don't know why anybody would want one, but that's what they're doing. Anyway, despite the kind of, I don't know quite the image I want here, despite the kind of modernist appearance of the buildings, which is sort of surprising for the Nazis, nevertheless, again, the landscape was the big programs. So all these things were supposed to be very carefully inserted into the landscape, and they went to a lot of trouble to save these trees. In the architect's rendering, you don't see the trees, but I think as architects we know, a lot of times you leave the trees and the vegetation off so you can see the buildings, right? But that wasn't really the point. This was really, the construction photo gives you a better idea of how that was supposed to be set up. So these, you know, all of these areas were supposed to be then you know, connected into this complex. So that was part of the overall experience of being there. And this is a view from the sea, because there was supposed to be a series of ships that would then take you to these, there was supposed to be a collection of 4 of them all together. And you can see here this rather dramatic image here of the lighthouse by the sea. Now, the last group was a group of 5, and I'm only going to show you 2 today because of time. Anyway, the last are the smallest, and they're all related literally to the ground. And some of them are, well, one of them was where someone was a German, you know, terrorist, let's say, was assassinated by the French occupying authority, and so that became one place. Another was the site of a World War I battle. Another site of a battle in the early 20s, where the Germans drove off the Poles, and this was during the period when they were trying to decide where to put the boundary, right, between Germany and Poland. And another one was from an ancient battle where under Charlemagne murdered Saxons who refused to be Christians, and this is, you know, let's say going back into the early Middle Ages. So these are the kind of places that were memorialized, and again, they were real pilgrimage sites, right? And it was really about the kind of, the design was really about the ground that they actually stood on. Oops. This is the first one I'll show you here, the Saxon Grove. This is the one I was talking about, where this is allegedly, although they've realized that was a myth, where the site is, where I forget, something like 2,000 Saxons were murdered, the local people, by Charlemagne, Charles the Great. Anyhow, the idea came up that this would be almost like, not really a cemetery, but a kind of memorial. And so these stones were to be brought from different areas around Saxony and set up, and each one was to represent a murdered Saxon. And so it's kind of hard for me to imagine a more literal embodiment of this blood and soil idea, right? And so this was a project of Heinrich Himmler, who ran the SS, this kind of secret police organization, right? And the whole idea was they were supposed to be able to process around this field. It started out as this kind of diagram here, and they decided, well, actually, no, what they would do is these paths around natural elevation here. This is built on a kind of, it's on earthwork berm here going across. And for some reason, there's a view of the church, which is kind of odd considering that the whole thing is memorializing murdered Christians, right? But anyway, the idea was that they would process with torches into the center, and then there would be the, ceremony there. And this was all supposed to be recalling, medieval German tradition, but of course, much of it was invented. Anyway, there's a little diagram there showing you the stones and how these were supposed to be collected and arranged. And then you get these pictures here of these walkways lined with the stones. And here's a more contemporary view of it. And this place was also really, because it's Lower Saxony, which is not too far from Hanover, and that was supposed to be like the heartland of Germany, right? So that's the kind of, not necessarily geopolitical, that's the kind of cultural landscape significance of this place. And this is the last project I'll show you, Tannenberg. Tannenberg was actually a late medieval battle. This site was actually a battle that was run by Hindenburg, was a really successful general in World War I, and he defeated the Russians there. But they decided to use this older name of Tannenberg for the memorial because it had more cachet to it, let's say. So it was decided by, basically right-wing conservatives in the early 20s to build this site. And they picked these two architects from Berlin, brothers, Johannes and Walter Krüger. And later they brought in Heinrich Wiebking. But this is on the lower left side. You'll see the first version of it that the Krügers did. Then the Nazis came along, so this isn't quite right? And in the meantime, Hindenburg died. Hindenburg didn't want to be buried there, but Hitler decided it would be really great to move he and his wife's coffins there and make this, this new kind of ceremonial entry here to this huge crypt. And then they wanted a more ceremonial meeting area because that's, of course, really critical for them, right? And here they decided to have a new landscape development for it. Now, originally, it's on a flat site. This kind of indicates that it's rising, but it wasn't. And the architects weren't really happy with the site that was chosen, but it was too late, right? And here is what Wiebking did to make it look like it was on a hill. And again, this was really critical for them. So this is the original site. So what Wiebking did was to excavate these areas and to make it look like, and actually build it up a little bit, I think over here, as though it had some land elevation. So again, it wasn't just a kind of aesthetic gesture. It's about rooting this monument in the ground, right? And over here on the left, on the right-hand side, we see his one of his first regional planning schemes. And here is the actual monument. But he wants to create a cultural landscape out of the farmland there. And he talks about how important the German farmland is. And they're very clear that this is not Slavic, this is a Germanic area. So that was part of how that ended. Now, this is my final slide. And this is Heinrich Wiebking again, the landscape architect. And he came out with this plan. He was hired to do it by the people who were running the general plan for the East, because the idea was to completely redesign what's now Poland and beyond that as well. And so they were going to reorganize the field lines so they were more rational and create new villages. And of course, everything was going to be wiped out because the Slavs didn't know what they were doing. So although, again, these farmhouses as individual buildings aren't monumental, you can imagine the monumental scale of that project. Now, this was a kind of, taking this idea of consolidation that they'd already been working on before the war out into the territories to the east, right? So the process would just continue on to the east. Now, I'll conclude with that, but I just wanted to say, the point of my lecture is not that there's anything wrong with landscape planning or embedding buildings in the landscape. But the problem is the kind of political agenda, particularly the racial agenda that's been associated with the Nazis. And we can also think back on the statue of Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville. Things change, and people that put that up were probably not terribly radical, but they thought that was great. And of course, now a lot of people don't think it is. I'm not trying to argue that any of these things were bad, but I just want to raise awareness of the importance of these kind of political issues and this kind of social exclusion for us as designers. And again, it hasn't gone away, these topics. So thanks very much for your time.